conference will now be recorded.
Thank you very much for signing up and coming to the 5 strategies to manage stress by building resilience with our keynote speaker and Avanti Women big supporter, Siobhan. Siobhan is going to be speaking with you about her experience as a leader of learning and development and as a leader of change management on how to handle stress and be able to work with it and be resilient. Siobhan, I'm going to give you the presenter role now. Please pull up your screen. Before I go to Siobhan, there's one small thing I need to do. For everybody, please mute your lines. Siobhan will be taking all your questions at the end. She will be asking you some questions during the presentation. Please answer the questions in the chat and in the chat option on GoToMeeting. But leave all the questions to the end. Please mute your lines so that we don't have any issues with the voice in the background. Siobhan, I'm going to make you the presenter now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maha. Perfect. There we go. Can you all see the screen now? Okay, I'm going to assume that you can see the screen in full presenter mode and that you can hear me.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll just give you a little bit of background in terms of who I am. I am a keynote speaker and I'm speaking for various audiences and events and conferences. I'm currently the Director of Learning and Development at Intellect, which is a company focused on environmental health, safety, and quality. I'm an award-winning published author, expert in change management and leadership. I've spoken to over 2,500 attendees from 71 different countries. I am a comic book nerd, superhero nerd that is, axe thrower, candy holic, mother and wife, and lately I've taken up some archery. So I like to have some fun in addition to just talking about change management and leadership. So today as Ma said, we're going to be talking about the 5 strategies to manage stress with resilience. And we're going to talk a little bit more around, what that looks like. And I know many of you have probably seen people who are really resilient. They manage to remain positive in the face of adversity. Whenever they're dealing with stress, they are able to sort of forge through that. Versus other people you may know who, when they manage or have to deal with stress, they seem to take it on a lot more internally. It tends to ruin their day. It might even bring down their mood. They will sometimes get consumed with that. And the difference between those that are really resilient versus those that aren't as resilient could be a variety of reasons. Oftentimes it's your upbringing, it's your experience, it could be your education, it could be a number of different factors, but the key ingredient is your ability to be able to deal with situations and continue to be productive. And that's really, in essence, what resilience is about. So today we're going to talk a bit about how do you prioritize your goals and your times and your energy when you're dealing with stressful situations. How can you eliminate some of those distractions and then ensure that you're scheduling time for the most important resource, which is you and self-care. And I think that's an aspect that many of us don't really pay enough attention there, because we're so focused with the day-to-day stuff that we put ourselves on the back burner. But the reality is, if we don't focus in on ourselves, then we're never going to have time to do anything else effectively. So many people tend to ask me, what is resilience, and really what does that mean as it relates to change and being able to deal with stress or just sort of any adversity? And resilience is really the process of adapting well when you're dealing with adversity, change, a tragedy, some sort of significant stress. It could be something like a job change, a death in the family, And then there's also like really great changes, sort of like a birth in the family, or you buy a new house. So there's some stress that comes with that, but it's also excitement. And your ability to bounce back from difficult experiences and not having a lot of unproductive time is really what makes you a resilient individual. So when you're dealing with a lot of stress, we tend to get caught up in that. And resilience is your ability to bounce back and to be able to increase the time it takes you to be productive again. Because we all know that when we deal with change or adversity, there are some periods where you will be a bit unproductive, whether it is because you are thinking through what's happening, you get consumed with it. But when we're able to reduce that unproductive time and to be able to move forward, this is where we start moving into resiliency mode. Linda Hoops is one of the authors of Resiliency and one of the founders, and she talks a lot about reducing that unproductive time. So that's really what we want to start focusing in on, resilience and how we can be more productive with our time and our energy. So in terms of the 5 strategies for building resilience to help manage stress, we're going to sort of focus on these things. So the first one is you need to accept that change is part of just general living in our day-to-day. The second is know what your goals are. And once you're very clear in terms of what those are, then you can take action to move towards them. And this is where being able to make very decisive actions come into play. Because once you are confident in terms of what it is you need to accomplish, it's easier for you to make decisions that are in alignment with that. Number 4 talks about eliminating distractions and being able to nurture a more positive outlook, generally speaking, in life. And then the number 5, which is, last but definitely not least, is being able to set aside time to take care of yourself, because you are the most important person. And if you're not taking care of yourself, it's difficult for you to be able to take care of others. So we're going to talk about each of these in a bit more detail. So we'll start off with number 1. In terms of change is just a general part of life. And I think many of you have experienced change at some point of your life in one fashion or another. And generally speaking, change has now become the new constant. It doesn't really matter where you work or what you do, you're constantly experiencing change, and now at an ever more rapid pace. So when we're dealing with change, there's a lot of different emotions that we experience. And William Bridges talks about these 3 stages of transition that people tend to go through when they're dealing with change. They will most generally they'll have a resistance period where things are starting to end and they know that this impending change is about to happen. And then they go through like this chaotic period of time, what he calls the neutral zone, and you're experiencing different emotions and trying things out. And then you get to the new state where you've now committed to the new change, and we call it the new beginnings. But similar to this change curve, the Dr. Kubler-Ross did a lot of research where she took a look at the whole change curve, how change curve is very much related to death, and how when people are experiencing that, it's the same sort of stages as what happens when they're going through change. So initially, when you are faced with some sort of stressor, whether that be with your work, it could be at home, it could be some sort of function that event that you're trying to plan or put together, there's an initial point when that change occurs that you go through a denial where you're like, what? No, they're really asking me to do this? No, they're kind of joking, even if it's just for a split second. And then you tend to go into this sort of like a bit of an anger or hostility. Sometimes it is the form of blaming towards other people, like they came up with this really stupid idea. Now you're asking me to do this. This is causing me a lot of stress and anxiety. And so there's a little bit of hostility that occurs there. Then we start to go down that deep down resistance path where we start to bargain. And bargaining could look like, I'm going to do what I think is the best thing to do and show them that we don't really need to do the course of action they're asking me to do. So let's say, for instance, they've asked you to adopt a new system at work. You might use the old one and start ramping up and showing them that we don't actually need to change because what we have currently right now works just fine. That's actually a form of bargaining. It's showing people that that we don't need to change and things can sort of stay status quo. But once you see that, this change is happening regardless of what I'm doing right now, then we start getting even more upset. And this is where we hit the lowest point in any type of change or any type of stress that we're under. We call it sort of the depression. So this is the lowest of the lows, where we feel this sense of high anxiety and just like helplessness. But then something really neat happens if we allow ourselves to move forward with that change. It is acceptance. So this is where we start experimenting, we start trying things out, we start seeing that, you know what, it's not so bad. We can actually get this. And we have training, we've got supporters, we've got coaches that will help us through the change curve, and then things become a bit easier. And then we eventually move towards the new beginnings and a commitment. So as you can see with the change curve, while it looks like it's just a simple curve, the reality is there's a lot of up and downs that happen when you're dealing with stress. So sometimes things seem better, like, oh, I'm finally seeing some light, and then something else happens and you feel like you're getting knocked down a bit, and then you'll go back up again. So just know that the change curve itself isn't exactly like how it shows there. There are a lot of ups and downs along the way. But the point on with resilience, is once you get through that, then you can start moving on to the next thing that happens. And as I said, change is the new constant. So whenever you finish one change, that's not it. Like, more is coming, and then we just have to build up our resiliency levels to be able to manage it. So when we're able to manage change, this is where we can accelerate the time it takes for us to get from point A to B, but we also start to reduce those negative consequences. And so this is where the strategies of resiliency really comes into place. It allows us to take a look and a step back of who we are, what are some of our strengths, and how can we leverage those to be able to deal with stress in a much more effective way. So are we more organized? Are we being flexible? Are we exploring different options? Are we being thought-provoking? Are we looking at our resources and what's available to us and looking at it from a very positive framework, as opposed to focusing on all the negatives? The thing is, if you try to move through that change curve too fast and you move to the far end and say, oh, this is really great, I just accept it, and I'm just move, this sounds like a good idea, and just move on to acceptance, you will likely slide back on the change curve, because you have to go through each of those processes, each of those stages, in order to get to the ending state. So I know I've given you quite a lot of bit of information. That's a very high level overview of sort of what happens as you're experiencing stress or a change in your life. And if you're focusing on the positive outlooks and the strengths that you do bring to it, then you can accelerate the amount of time it takes you to get through that change, as well as being more productive. And that's really where resiliency comes into play. So the second aspect for you to sort of make the right decision is to really know what your goals are. What is it that you really want to get out of this situation? So, Stephen Covey, he talks a lot about begin with the end in mind. So know where it is you want to be or what your end state is before you can start making any actions. So to know your goals, you need to be very proactive with your time. You need to make sure that you're engaged in activities that are going to support your goals, both in the long term as well as in the short term. And it makes sense for you to really have a conversation and really sort of think through, what is it that I need to accomplish? Where is my end state? What are my goals? What do I really want to achieve? And then make a list of all the things that you need to accomplish to make that goal happen for the day or for the week. And then what is it that you need to focus your efforts on in order to achieve what we call optimal results? And that's really going to shift your focus. So you're not going to be focusing so much on the big stressor, but what are the small little tasks? So you're breaking things down into manageable chunks that are easier for you to be able to tackle versus the big stress or whatever is causing you this amount of anxiety or the change that's occurring. So when you're looking at, well, what should my primary goals be? So take a look at, what are some of your top priorities? And there's this rule that Pareto talks about. It's called the 80-20 rule, where you focus on, the top 20 things that you do in the day will create 80% of your results. So when you're dealing with a new change, try to look at what are the key activities that I need to deal with to do that's going to be able to mitigate the change in the most impactful way, which is the 80% of the results. So I throw that to you just so you can remember that in terms of trying to figure out, where should I be spending the most of my time? And the other thing with setting goals and helping you to make decisions is decide in terms of what's important versus what is urgent. Stephen Covey talks a lot about importance and urgency. So importance is really knowing what activities are important and that you personally find valuable, as long as it's contributing to your overall mission, your values, and your high priority goals, which you've just already put out as you wrote that list for the week or for the day. And then urgency is an activity that is urgent or requires your immediate attention or immediate action. So sometimes people will come at you and they'll say, oh, this is really urgent. I need you to take care of this right now. But it might not necessarily be as urgent as they're saying. So you really have to take it into context. What is it that you need to accomplish, and what are their goals, and why are they're pushing this as something that's urgent? But is it really urgent to your top goals? And sometimes your top goals, as you're asking someone else to do you a favor, might not be overly urgent for them, but you're going to have to figure out ways to be persuasive to get key things done. So it's a bit of a trade-off, but you need to understand in terms of the overall metrics what is important and what is urgent. And sometimes there's going to be some overlaps in where you need to focus your time and your energy on. So to take decisive actions and to be able to prioritize wisely, you need to know the difference between what's important and urgent that you have to do right now, what's important, but if you neglect it, it might become urgent. And then all the things that are not important, so that you can sort of like reject it or delegate it diplomatically to somebody else. So the things that you really need to focus on would be in the top left quadrant, which is your important and urgent. So these are the things you need to do right now. So they will come in as major stressors. So these would be your major emergencies, your crises, the things that you have to focus on right now, demands that you might get from senior leaders, any imminent deadlines that have to be addressed, any necessary meetings or important appointments that you need to take. Those are the things that you need to be focusing your time and your energy on. The other things that are important but might not necessarily be urgent, but if you don't deal with it right now, can easily become urgent, would be like scheduling, preparation, researching and investigation, building relationships with people. And that one might seem like, really, I need to build relationships, and that could become urgent. It absolutely can become urgent, because if you don't take the time to build those relationships when you need to get things done, that's not the time to build the relationships. That's when you need to leverage relationships and networks in order to move things forward. Same with delegation and monitoring. You need to delegate work to people in advance so that they're not being rushed at the last moment to get stuff done. Process development can also be something that's important, so that you know the flow of how things are supposed to be handled, and you're not waiting till it becomes an urgent matter to then focus on process. And then any activities that you can anticipate or prevent from becoming urgent are things that you should be also focusing on. So really, we want to be focusing on quadrants 1 and 2. And then the things that are not as important, so requests that you can hand off to other people very diplomatically, you have to find ways of letting people know, what, I can't handle this right now, but perhaps somebody else. So it's more like delegation. Or if you're duplicating effort, you're finding inefficiencies, those are things that you want to reject and not spend a lot of time on. And then things that you want to not spend your time on at all, those are the cease and desist, would be things that are totally not important or not urgent, like taking excessive communications, like when we're on social media and we're talking and we're spending hours on FaceTime or on let's say Instagram, and we're chatting with people. That can take up a lot of time, and before you know it, when you thought it was only going to take 5 minutes, you're now at like an hour or two. So that's a rabbit hole. Even myself, I have found myself in, sometimes just thinking it was just going to take a few minutes, and then I spent an excessive amount of time on that and I have to stop. So we're going to talk about some tips on how to deal with a lot of those non-important, not urgent items, to ensure that we're really spending and focusing our time on the most important stuff. So the major thing for us to focus on are like, what are our big rocks? What are the key things that when we're dealing with change and we're dealing with stress, that we should be focusing our time and our energy on? And so these are the most important stuff, like your family, your work, your exercise, time for yourself, serving others. Perhaps it is religion, whatever are the things that are really important to you. That's the stuff that you need to be scheduling into your day-to-day, your activities or your weekly agendas. You need to put time in for that, and then schedule in everything else. So oftentimes we get filled with stress because we're like, I can't fit everything in, and I'm trying to do a million things. And I can tell you, even as a mom and as an employee working for people, that sometimes it feels overwhelming because there's just so much stuff. But what I found works really well is just schedule time in your calendar for the big rocks, the most important stuff. And then everything else just seems to sort of fit into all the spaces that are left. And then whatever doesn't get fit in, next week you'll sort of deal with it. So remember, figure out what are your big rocks? What are the main things that are important to you that you need to put time and energy into your schedule to focus in on, and that's where you should put your time, your energies on, and then all the other stuff you can find time to fill in your schedule afterwards. The another tip for you is just to eliminate any of those tasks that you know realistically you're never going to get around to doing it. So just purge those, just get rid of them, or delegate that to somebody else, or just agree to yourself that it's just not going to get done, because that is a time waster. And sometimes those are difficult things to do because they might be fun things, but it's really not the best use of your time. And then it's causing you stress and anxiety on the back end because you didn't have time to do the things that are really needed to get done. The other thing is learning how to say no and how to delegate. Just saying no to people is sometimes very difficult, especially for women, I find, because we have this innate inclination to want to say yes to people because we want to please them. But note that you're in control of your own time. You can choose to say yes or no. And note that if you say no to if you're saying yes to everybody else, you're saying no to yourself. So sometimes you're going to have to say no to requests that are not in alignment with your goals, with your priorities, or that are unimportant or they're not urgent, because it makes sense in order for you to be able to get things done. Or you can diplomatically say no or delegate it to somebody else who then might be better suited to take on that particular task. So be prepared to focus your energies on more productive tasks and reducing and getting rid of and purging tasks that aren't adding value. And wherever possible, try not to overcommit. So say no up front if you know you just don't have the time, or at least manage expectations so that you're not feeling immense stress and anxiety coming out of saying yes to everything. Delegating is an awesome activity too, because you don't have to take everything on. There are some people that take a lot of joy in doing those tasks that you don't like doing. So if you can, find somebody else who's better suited and delegate it to them. And then also be open to sometimes you may have to swap work if need be to take on other things that other people don't need, just so that you're helping. So it's sort of like a give and take thing. Sometimes you'll delegate to others, sometimes they'll get delegated to you, but you always need to figure out where can you focus your time and energy and manage your time accordingly. So I want you to think about last week, and where did you spend the majority of your time? Was it in activities that were important and urgent? Was it activities that were just important but not really urgent? Or did you find that you were spending a lot of your time on activities that really were time wasters? And I want you to be honest with yourself as you're answering this question. You don't have to answer it out loud or to everyone else, but really think back, if you were stressed or you felt like, look, I was taking on a lot of stuff, where were you spending the majority of your time? Because going forward for this week and next week coming up, I want you to start looking at your calendar and start revisiting it and putting in your big rocks in your calendar first, and then filling it up with the other things. So making sure that the first most important stuff gets dealt with first, and then the other things get dealt with afterwards. And so I'm going to give you a couple of tips to help you deal with some of those time wasters, with those distractions that you just love so much. Like for me, binge watching, and especially on Netflix, is probably one of my favorite hobbies, but I know that I can't do that all the time because it does take up an enormous amount of my time, and I have lots of things that I have to do. And so while we all enjoy watching or binge watching shows, or even going on social media a lot, we do need to take into consideration how much of that time could be better used doing something else. Or do we want to make sure that we've done, like this is more of a reward for getting things done? And if so, by all means, get your popcorn ready and your glass of wine and have some fun by binge watching. But then take a look at how much time are we spending on all these things, like say like social media, for instance. I find social media is a huge distractor. As soon as I get up in the morning, there's almost an insatiable need, I find, for most people to just want to pick up their phone and start looking at, well, what happened while I was sleeping at night? Must be something good. And the first thing we do is we want to go to Facebook or we go to Instagram and we start checking and scrolling through to see what are all of these things that happen while you were at sleep at night. And then you realize that before you know it, a good half hour to an hour goes by where that could have been more productive doing something else. So my suggestion in terms of helping to reduce those distractions is just set time limits. In your phones, most people, there's a timer in there. You can set, okay, 30 minutes. And when the timer goes off, then you stop and then you go on to doing something else. The other thing is you can turn off those notifications. You can even see in this picture here how there's tons of notifications that are constantly popping up. That is also a stress inducer too, especially if you're in a meeting and then you've got notifications that are constantly popping up, and our inclination would be, let me just check that message quickly, even though you know you can't action it because you're supposed to be paying attention to what you're doing in the meeting. We check it anyways. And then we can't do anything about it, but we're stressing all through the meeting. Then after the meeting is done, we got to go back and reread and then try to answer it. So we're spending twice the amount of time and energy on that, whereas we could have been focused and present in the moment where we're in that meeting. So just consider perhaps turning off notifications, especially when you're in meetings, so that it's less stress that's induced. Sometimes you can't do that because depending on your position or your role or what's happening, you might still have to be responding to messages, in which case that's not a great idea. But you don't have to respond to your Facebook messages while you're in a meeting. So you can turn that notification off, or your Twitter, or maybe even LinkedIn, but you only have your emails coming in. Or whereas we use Teams, so sometimes we'll have our Teams chat or instant message. Some people use Slack, and then they'll use that as a mode of instant message and leave those notifications on, but not everything you have to have on. My final tip too for social distractions, just pay attention to who you're following too, because who you follow will also influence how you feel about yourself. So you want to follow people that are positive and start eliminating any of those negative influences. You want to follow people who are going to be inspiring, who make you feel good about yourself, not those that are going to make you start thinking and self-deprecating thoughts and sort of thinking of lack. Those are the ones that you might want to unfollow, or sort of really think, do I really need to be spending as much time looking at their pages or looking at their life or wishing that that was something that I was doing? Because all those things are social distractions, but they also create another set of stressors to your life. So just pay attention to who you're following and try to focus more on the positive. And that will also help nurture an overall positive outlook in your life. Now, the last of the 5 steps are you getting enough sleep? So you need to take care of yourself and personal self-care. I find that many of us as workers, we don't spend enough time getting rested at night. What we tend to do is focus a lot of our energies on doing work, or we're constantly thinking through, or we stay up late at night doing things because we're trying to make sure everything is in place for the next day, and we're not getting enough sleep. So my question is to you is, how many hours of sleep do you think an adult needs? So in the chat box, just take a quick second here and type in what your response is. Do you think it's A, 3 to 5 hours, B, 5 to 7 hours, C, 7 to 9 hours, or D, 9 to 12 hours? And Maha, tell me what you see is the majority of the people are saying.
So far, I see for the most part, it says C, but I'm sure you can also see the results.
Yeah. Okay, so most of us think it's C, right?
Yeah.
And to be honest, that's where I typically, I don't even know if I get 7 hours. I think I'm on about 6 hours, which is really bad. But adults actually need 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night. I don't know how many of us are actually getting that, so that's probably part of the joke there. I think our kids were probably getting somewhere around that 9 to 12 hours, but most of us as adults are not. So we really need to make sure that we're getting plenty of rest as well as exercise, because an alert mind is a high functioning mind, and that's one that's less tolerant of time wasting activities. And we're also going to be more productive. So we can manage our stress a bit better because we're now more alert because we've got the rest that we need. We also need to consider mindfulness, things like meditation or hobbies or relaxation activities. And this all helps for us to be able to manage our stress at a much better or deeper level. A meditation exercise you can consider doing even at your desk is just take 2 minutes of breathing in and breathing out. And if you do that, you'll find that your stress levels will reduce by about 30% if you're able to do that for even up to 2 minutes. So it's a 2-minute exercise that you can do even immediately when you go back to your desk on just how to reduce your stress levels by 30% just by breathing in and out for 2 minutes calmly. So just clear your minds and try that exercise. Just breathe in, usually for 3 or 4 seconds, and then breathe out. And if you continue to do that for 2 minutes, you'll reduce your stress by about 30%. So that's actually a really cool tip there. So navigating stress, we know, can be really stressful, especially when you want to maintain your productivity. So we encourage you to take the time in your schedules for self-care, because the most important person here is you. And if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of others and you can't manage your stress levels. Resiliency is really just a form of being more productive with your time and spending and reducing the unproductive time so that you can get to where you need to be by focusing on your end goals and taking decisive action along the way. So to quickly recap, we've taken a look at 5 key strategies in how to manage change. How to manage stress. So the first thing is we need to be able to accept that change is just a natural course of our lives and that we need to be able to deal with that. To practice resiliency on an ongoing basis. Just look at different ways that we can manage our time, manage our energy, and to be more productive with the time that we do have. And then prioritize time in your schedule for self-care, because you are the most important person. So I want to thank all of you for your time. And if you have any questions, we'd like to open up the line now for anybody who has any questions with regards to resiliency or change or managing stress. You can go ahead and shoot them at me now.
Thank you very, very much, Siobhan. If you guys have a question, unmute your line and ask your question, but then mute it back again, please. Or you can type them in the chat box. We have a question from Michelle. I hope I'm saying the name right. She's saying, how does your expertise in change management help you as an individual? Are there ways that mentorship helps with this, identifying and giving solutions?
Okay, so it's like a 2-part question. With change management, you deal with a lot of stress because you're often introducing new initiatives that people tend to resist because people like to do things the same way they always have been doing. So there's quite a few strategies that you need to introduce to help people understand why you're doing something. So a lot of times people get stressed out because they don't understand the why, and you're jumping to a solution and there's a big gap for them in between. So I find explaining to people why something's happening, what the benefits are for them, and if there's no benefits, and at least explaining to them what's the impact going to be on them, being open and honest and transparent, and then making sure that you have help for them along the process. So whether that be training, it be coaching or mentoring along the way, really helps to reduce that stress when dealing with change. As far as a mentor is concerned, they can help you with experience because they've usually gone through a lot of the change in advance. And this is why you're going to somebody who has more experience or is where you would like to be. And they can ask you questions to help you think through the process a bit better. They can also provide you with guidance and support along the way so that you could avoid a lot of the pitfalls that maybe they've gone through or they've seen their colleagues experience. So a mentor is a really great resource, especially when dealing with change, because then you can be honest with them. You can be real and tell them exactly how you're feeling and thinking, and they can validate that for you. And they can also provide you with some really good expertise as well as tips on how to process that change or how to manage it, or things you could do to get ahead of the curve.
Thank you, Siobhan. I think Michelle, Siobhan was able to answer the 2 questions, weaving the answers together somehow. So I hope this answers your questions. Are there any other questions? Elizabeth, she says, at work, what kind of tips do you find helpful? Communication with peers, supervisors? Do you use communities of practice to enable informal learning?
All of the above. I find when you're able to talk to your peers, they give you a completely different perspective than, say, your supervisors or your managers. So your peers are going to give you like peer to peer, especially when you're dealing with stressful situations. And I also like to have peers that don't work with me too, because they're going to give me an external point of view on how to deal with certain situation, your managers and your supervisors, they're going to give you their point of view from management level. So they may be able to give you more insights in terms of why something has happened, what the thought process was involved in coming to this decision. They can also help explain the vision and where you're going. But I do recommend having really strong communications with people and frequent communications. So when there's a change that's about to occur, you need to communicate it to people about 7 to 15 times. And that sounds like a lot, but people will get wrapped up in a whole bunch of other projects. Their time gets pulled in multiple different directions, and they're also being communicated very heavily. So your message can get lost in transition. So you need to make sure that you're communicating often with people, especially if you're the one leading the change. Now, when it comes to you being the one having the change put on you, you want to be able to deal with people and communicate with them often so you know what's happening. So you want constant updates, and you can ask for those too. And that can also be a cue to the person who's running the change that there's not sufficient communication occurring. Communities of practice is also a really great way to find out what's happening with other organizations that are similar to yours and that may be different but are experiencing a similar type of a change. So that's going to give you a very broad perspective in terms of what's happening outside of your industry. And even if it's not the exact same, there's so many ideas that you can learn from communities of practice, because the whole point of that is to share information so that collectively you can go through the initiatives better and that you can learn from each other's mistakes. I think community practices is one of the best ways to share information quickly, and you get a broad perspective across multiple industries. And then when you go in and you're talking to others, you now are coming in with much more expertise than you would if you had only went to your manager or supervisor or to your peers. So I'd strongly recommend doing that, and do your research. So make sure that you're talking to not only the communities of practice, but you're looking at what are some of the thought leaders saying about this? What existing research exists that you can pull data from so you can help with your arguments for or against something, a change, and that you can argue in a much more intelligent way, but you're also being open-minded to dispiriting information, so that gives you a much more broader perspective and you're more informed in making your decisions.